afternoon. Why have you been sitting here so long? Can I see your license and registration?
Officer, am I being detained or am I free to leave?
You're not free to leave. You're acting suspicious. Step out of the vehicle now.
Respectfully, without reasonable suspicion, that order is not lawful.
The late afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt of the Oak Creek Commercial District, creating a hazy shimmer that distorted the distant traffic. Inside his idling patrol cruiser, Officer David Miller let the air conditioning blast against his face, his eyes constantly scanning the parking lot of the high-end retail plaza. Miller had been on the force for 14 years, a tenure that had calcified his policing style into something entirely reliant on what he liked to call his gut instinct. He believed he possessed a sixth sense for crime before it happened, an unspoken radar that allowed him to read the streets. But instinct, unexamined and unchecked, often masquerades as intuition when it is, in reality, nothing more than deeply ingrained bias. On this sweltering Tuesday, Miller's instinct was hyper-focused on a sleek, late-model sedan that had been parked near the edge of the lot for the past 15 minutes. The vehicle wasn't blocking traffic, nor was it parked illegally. It was merely stationary, but to Miller, the driver did not fit the unspoken, invisible profile of the neighborhood. Through the tinted glass of his cruiser, Miller watched the man behind the wheel. The driver was a black man in his late 40s, dressed cleanly in a crisp, button-down shirt, his attention absorbed by a thick binder of paperwork resting on his steering wheel. He wasn't looking around nervously. He wasn't checking the mirrors. He was simply reading. Yet Miller's mind began to construct a narrative out of thin air. He ran the license plate through the mobile data terminal mounted on his dashboard. The system returned a slow, buffering screen before displaying that the vehicle was registered to a municipal fleet trust, a generic holding classification often used for city or state-owned vehicles. Rather than deducing that the man might be a city employee on official business, Miller's mind immediately jumped to the assumption that the vehicle was either stolen or involved in some sort of unauthorized use. The bias was not a loud, cartoonish hatred. It was a quiet, bureaucratic assumption of criminality. Miller put his cruiser into drive and slowly rolled across the lot, pulling up at an angle that partially blocked the sedan's exit, a deliberate tactical maneuver designed to establish dominance and initiate what he considered a routine consensual encounter. The heavy thud of Miller's boots on the pavement signaled his approach. He adjusted his utility belt, resting his right hand casually over the holster of his sidearm, a posture intended to project authority, but one that inherently escalated the tension of the moment. He walked up to the driver's side window and tapped the glass twice with his knuckles. Inside the car, the man calmly closed his binder, placed it on the passenger seat, and pressed the button to roll down his window. A wave of cool air escaped the vehicle. The man looked up at Miller, his expression neutral, his hands remaining clearly visible on the top of the steering wheel. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, his voice steady and polite, devoid of the anxiety Miller usually expected from the people he stopped. Miller leaned in slightly, his sunglasses reflecting the man's calm face. "Afternoon. I need to see your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance," Miller demanded, bypassing any preliminary greeting or explanation for his presence. The man did not reach for his pockets. He did not frantically search the glove compartment. Instead, he kept his hands on the wheel and met Miller's gaze. "May I ask why I am being stopped, officer?" he inquired. The question was a simple one, rooted in the foundational principles of American jurisprudence, but to Miller it felt like an act of defiance. Miller scoffed softly, shifting his weight. "You're not being stopped. I'm just making contact. We've had some burglaries in the area, and you've been sitting here for quite a while. Now, hand over your ID." The man shook his head slowly, a subtle gesture of patient disagreement. "Officer, if I am not being detained, then I am not required to provide identification. Am I free to leave?" The phrase hung in the thick summer air. It was the precise legal standard that differentiated a consensual encounter from an investigative detention, commonly known as a Terry stop. Miller felt a flush of irritation creeping up his neck. He despised when citizens attempted to play sidewalk lawyer. "No, you're not free to leave," Miller snapped, the tone of his voice dropping an octave into a hardened command. "You are acting suspiciously, and I am conducting an investigation. Now, for the last time, give me your identification." The man in the car remained entirely unruffled by the sudden escalation. "Officer," he began, his voice carrying the calm cadence of a seasoned instructor, "under the Fourth Amendment, in order to detain me, you must have reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime. Being parked legally in a commercial lot in broad daylight reading paperwork does not meet the threshold of reasonable suspicion. It is not a crime to sit in a car. Therefore, your demand for my identification is not a lawful order. The legal precision of the man's response struck a nerve. Miller's procedural knowledge was rusty, often paved over by years of commanding compliance through sheer intimidation. He didn't have articulable facts. He couldn't point to a shattered window, a matched suspect description, or a witnessed hand-to-hand transaction. He only had his instinct, which the courts had repeatedly ruled was an insufficient basis for a seizure. But stepping down now, retreating from the window, felt like a surrender of his authority. The ego of the badge took over. "All right, that's it," Miller barked, stepping back and pointing a rigid finger at the driver. "Step out of the vehicle. You are failing to obey a lawful order and obstructing a governmental operation." He was relying on the fallback charges that plagued departments nationwide. Contempt of cop charges masquerading as criminal offenses. The man looked deeply disappointed, exhaling a quiet sigh before unbuckling his seatbelt. "I am complying with your physical commands under duress, officer, but I want to be abundantly clear that I believe this is an unlawful detention and an unlawful order to exit my vehicle." He opened the door and stepped out. He was taller than Miller, standing with a posture that commanded respect, yet he immediately turned his back, placing his hands flat against the roof of the car without being asked. It was a practice movement designed to remove any possible claim from the officer that he was making a furtive gesture or posing a threat. Miller grabbed the man's left wrist, forcefully pulling his arm behind his back. "You're making a big mistake, buddy," Miller muttered as he reached for his handcuffs. "The mistake is procedural, officer, and it is entirely yours," the man replied smoothly as the steel cuffs clicked and ratcheted tightly around his wrists. "You have detained me without reasonable suspicion. You are now arresting me without probable cause. You are skipping over the foundational elements of lawful policing because my presence here offended your sensibilities, not the law." Miller ignored the critique, conducting a rapid, aggressive pat-down of the man's clothing. A Terry frisk is strictly limited to a search for weapons to ensure officer safety, but Miller shoved his hands into the man's front pockets, extracting a thick leather wallet. He opened it, eager to finally see the name of the man who had the audacity to question him. But before Miller could read the driver's license, the man spoke up again. "I do not consent to a search of my person or my property. What you are doing is a blatant violation of my constitutional rights." Frustrated, Miller shoved the wallet back into the man's pocket, opting instead to grab him by the bicep and march him toward the cruiser. "You can tell it to the judge. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and failure to identify." The ride to the precinct was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. Miller navigated the city streets, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at his prisoner. The man wasn't fidgeting, wasn't yelling, and wasn't demanding a phone call. He was simply looking out the window, observing the passing cityscape with an analytical gaze. The complete lack of panic began to gnaw at the edges of Miller's confidence. Usually an arrestee either pleaded for leniency or hurled insults from the back seat. This quiet, observant patience was deeply unsettling. Miller tried to shake off the feeling of impending dread, reassuring himself that he had followed his instincts and that the desk sergeant would sort out the charges once they arrived. He convinced himself that the man was likely just a sovereign citizen or a well-read nuisance who had memorized a few lines from a legal textbook. When the cruiser finally pulled into the secured underground garage of the 4th Precinct, the stark fluorescent lights illuminated the concrete walls. Miller parked, killed the engine, and walked around to pull the man from the back seat. The precinct was in the middle of a shift change, the hallways buzzing with the chaotic energy of officers logging evidence, grabbing coffee, and exchanging updates. Miller walked his handcuffed suspect through the double doors, gripping his arm tightly as they navigated the crowded corridor toward the booking desk. The booking area was a raised platform where Desk Sergeant Ramirez sat surrounded by monitors, radios, and endless stacks of intake forms. Ramirez was a 20-year veteran, known for his encyclopedic knowledge of penal codes and his complete lack of patience for sloppy police work. Miller approached the desk, leaning casually against the high counter. "Hey, Ramirez, got one for intake, resisting, failure to identify, and obstruction." He gave the handcuffed man a slight shove forward so Ramirez could get a good look at him. Ramirez, who had been typing furiously on his keyboard, let out an annoyed sigh and looked over the rims of his reading glasses. For a second, the precinct around them seemed to operate at normal speed, a cacophony of ringing phones and overlapping conversations. But as Ramirez's eyes focused on the man in the handcuffs, the color rapidly drained from his face. The desk sergeant froze, his fingers hovering stiffly over the keys. He looked from the prisoner to Miller and then back to the prisoner, his mouth slightly open in an expression of sheer disbelief. "Officer Miller," Ramirez said, his voice dropping to a harsh, constrained whisper that somehow cut through the ambient noise of the room. "What the hell have you done?" Miller looked at Ramirez, confused by the visceral reaction. "What do you mean?" "Guy was casing the plaza on 5th Street, refused to ID, got combative. Standard procedure." The man in the handcuffs, who had remained silent since the parking lot, finally spoke. His voice was calm, carrying effortlessly across the booking area. "Sergeant Ramirez, I appreciate the prompt attention. If you could kindly contact Captain Harris and ask him to step out of his office, I would like him to witness the conclusion of this interaction." Before Ramirez could even reach for the phone, the heavy wooden door of the precinct captain's office swung open. Captain Harris, a stern man with a military bearing, stepped out, holding a manila folder. He glanced toward the booking desk, intending to ask Ramirez a question, but stopped dead in his tracks. The entire room seemed to quiet down as other officers noticed the shifting dynamic. Harris's eyes widened, his gaze locking onto the handcuffs binding the wrists of the man standing next to Miller. The captain's face morphed from confusion to absolute horror. He walked toward the desk with rapid, purposeful strides, entirely ignoring Miller as he approached the suspect. "Deputy Chief Vance," Captain Harris said, his voice tight with suppressed panic and profound embarrassment. What is happening here?" The words hit the air like a physical blow. Miller felt the blood rush out of his head, leaving a cold, ringing sensation in his ears. He turned to look at the man he had just dragged across town, Deputy Chief Marcus Vance, the newly appointed second-in-command of the entire city's police department, brought in just weeks ago from the State Bureau of Investigation to overhaul precinct training and address community policing standards. Vance had deliberately chosen not to have his photo circulated heavily upon his appointment, preferring to observe the department's day-to-day operations anonymously before implementing his reforms. Miller had not just arrested an innocent citizen, he had arrested the very architect of his department's future, a man who outranked everyone in the building. "Good afternoon, Captain Harris," Vance replied, his tone remaining perfectly level, though the weight of his authority was now unmistakably present. "I was in the Oak Creek district reviewing the proposed site for the new Community Liaison Center. I was sitting in my unmarked city fleet vehicle when Officer Miller here decided to initiate an investigative stop." Vance turned his head slightly to look at Miller, who was now visibly trembling, his hand hovering uselessly over his duty belt. "Officer Miller was unable to articulate any reasonable suspicion for the detention. When I exercised my Fourth Amendment rights and declined to provide identification during an unlawful seizure, he ordered me out of the vehicle, conducted an illegal search of my person, and placed me under arrest for contempt of his authority." Captain Harris's face turned crimson with rage. He spun around to face Miller. There was no screaming, no dramatic throwing of objects. The reality of police discipline, when it happens at this level, is not a theatrical display. It is a swift, icy, and brutal application of protocol. "Uncuff him, right now," Harris ordered, his voice dangerously low. Miller's hands shook so violently he could barely manage the small handcuff key. He fumbled with the metal locks, the sharp clicks echoing in the silent room as the cuffs fell away from Vance's wrists. Vance calmly rubbed his wrists, adjusting his cuffs, and retrieved his wallet from his own pocket, placing it securely in his jacket. "Officer Miller," Vance said, turning fully to face the man who had arrested him, "the most dangerous thing a police officer can carry is not a firearm. It is a badge backed by unexamined bias and a fundamental ignorance of the Constitution. You did not see a crime today. You saw a demographic. You operated on the assumption that my presence in that neighborhood required your permission. And when the law did not grant you the authority to demand my compliance, you used the threat of violence and the power of the state to force it. That is not policing. That is tyranny." Captain Harris stepped between them, his eyes locked onto Miller. "Miller, my office. Now." The walk to the captain's office felt like a death march for Miller. The eyes of every officer in the room bored into his back. The whispers had already started. Once inside, Harris didn't even bother sitting down behind his desk. He pointed to the small conference table. "Take it off, the belt, the weapon, the badge, put it on the table." Miller opened his mouth to speak, to try and explain the unexplainable, to talk about his instincts and his years of service. "Captain, I swear I thought—" "You didn't think, Miller," Harris interrupted, slamming his hand onto the desk. "You didn't think at all. You violated the fundamental civil rights of a man simply because he didn't bow down to your illegal demands. The fact that the man happened to be the deputy chief of police is my nightmare, but the fact that you would do this to any citizen is yours. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs. You will be placed on administrative leave without pay. Do not speak. Do not try to defend this. Just put your gear on the table. Within 5 minutes of walking through the precinct doors as an arresting officer, David Miller was stripped of the authority he had so carelessly abused. He unbuckled his heavy duty belt, the leather creaking loudly in the quiet office, and laid his sidearm and extra magazines on the polished wood. Finally, he reached up to his chest, unclasping the silver shield that he had worn for 14 years, and placed it next to the gun. He was escorted out of the precinct by a union representative out the back door, leaving his cruiser parked in the garage, a civilian once more facing the overwhelming machinery of the justice system he had so easily weaponized against others. Out in the booking area, Deputy Chief Vance stood quietly, watching the doors of the precinct swing shut behind the disgraced officer. The rapid dismantling of Miller's career wasn't a cause for celebration. It was a sobering reminder of the systemic failures that Vance had been hired to fix. The entire incident had been a terrifyingly perfect case study. If a man with an encyclopedic knowledge of constitutional law, a pristine record, and the highest rank in the department could be illegally detained, physically restrained, and arrested simply for existing in a parking lot, what hope did an ordinary citizen have against the unchecked ego of a biased officer? The events of that afternoon ripple outward, forcing a reckoning within the department and serving as a mirror for a society still grappling with the intersection of authority, race, and constitutional rights. It leaves us with a profound and necessary question. If the burden of knowing the law, remaining perfectly calm, and de-escalating a tense situation falls entirely upon the citizen being targeted, then what exactly is the purpose of the training given to the person wearing the badge? True justice isn't found in the instant firing of a bad cop. It is built through the relentless demand that those granted the power to take away our freedom must be the most rigorously bound by the laws that protect it.